All right, what's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the Home Field Podcast. So, in today's episode, basically just going to limit it to the NFC Report Card and some of the NBA news that's been going on the last few days. So, with the NFC Report Card, what we're going to do for that is we're going to go down each team in each division. We'll start with the NFC East, the NFC West, the NFC North, and then we'll finish off with the NFC South. We'll go over each team. We'll see where they are in the standings. We'll see which team may make either a comeback to either get into the playoffs or just a team that's just kind of looking on the outside in right now and possibly getting ready for next year's upcoming NFL draft. And then pretty much after that, what we'll do is we'll transition into some of the NBA news. So we'll go over the big trade that happened between the Washington Wizards and the Houston Rockets. We'll talk about Russell Westbrook ending up on the Wizards. We'll talk about John Wall ending up on the Rockets. We'll talk about how both of those players are going to impact those teams. And then we'll talk a little bit about Anthony Davis and LeBron James re-signing with the Lakers on contract extensions. Should be a fun episode, you guys. Hope you guys pay attention to it, give it a listen. And with all that said, let's get to it. All right, so let's hop into these NFC teams. So the first division we'll start with will be the NFC East, then the NFC West, then the NFC North, and then we'll wrap it up with the NFC South. So let's get the NFC East out of the way. So I know I've been meaning to do this for weeks, so let's just get through the NFC East in particular as soon as possible. So as it stands right now, the Giants are at the top of the division in the NFC East. Currently, they are technically tied with Washington, but I think the Giants own the tiebreaker. I'd have to double check, but I believe that the Giants own the tiebreaker in that division. But right now, with the Giants, here's the thing. I've said it before a couple of weeks ago when they were losing a bunch of close games. These were single-digit losses that they were having in the early part of the season. And I think really the Giants have rebounded to a certain extent. I know their record doesn't necessarily show it, but they've been extremely competitive in all of their games since I did the first NFC report card a few weeks ago. And to kind of like take account of where they are right now, it's kind of been more of the same. They're not the best team, and their record is 4-7, which obviously isn't that good. But, I mean, just looking at some of these scores, really within like the last 2 months, they're all fairly close. Most of these are single-digit games. Really, at most, they're like 4 or 5, maybe 7 points. But some of these games are really close. Against the Eagles in October, it was 22-21. They lost to the Bucks by 2 points the next week after. And then in the beginning of November, they won by 3 points against Washington. They did beat the Eagles by 10 points the week after that. And then last week when they played against the Bengals, they won by 2 points. And the one thing that I think for the Giants that we're going to have to keep in mind is what's going to happen to this team if Daniel Jones is out for an extended period of time. Because that's really the one thing that, by and large, is, I think, going to drive this team forward. I think defensively, to a certain extent, they've been playing great football. But if you don't have Daniel Jones there leading the offense, it's going to be tough sledding for this team. I just don't have the confidence that Colt McCoy can step in and really kind of push this team to the playoffs. And when I say push the team, I mean drag this team to the playoffs, because whoever's coming out of this division in the playoffs, they're going to have to drag their team to get there. And I don't believe that Colt McCoy is the guy to do that. And just looking at their next couple of games, I mean, they've got some pretty tough matchups over the next month or so. So they got the Seahawks upcoming this week. Then they got the Cardinals after that, the Browns, and then the Ravens. All of these teams have winning records. The Seahawks are in second place or tied for second place in the NFC right now. Then they got to go up against the Cardinals the week after, and the Cardinals are no slouch even though they lost to the Patriots last week. And then the Browns are second in the AFC North. at 8-3, and then they play the Ravens after that, just a day or two after Christmas. So this next month for the Giants is going to be crucial if they're going to make some sort of run into the playoffs. If Daniel Jones isn't in and they have to rely on Colt McCoy, I just don't think that he's going to be able to get it done. But as of right now, they are at the top of the division. If I have to give them a grade, I like this team simply because of the fact that they don't give up. They play 60 minutes, and they just continue to impress me, even though the record doesn't show it. So if I had to give them a grade, I'm going to give them, I'm thinking either like a C plus or a B minus. I think just because of their record, I'm going to give them a C plus. If they had a better record, I'd give them a B plus, just with how competitive they've been in the games the last couple weeks or so. But because of their record is 4-7, I'm going to give them a C plus. I think anything above that would kind of be giving them too much credit. So I think C plus is probably the best that I can give them. So like I said earlier, I talked about Washington for a little bit. Technically, they are tied in the division. They do have the same record as the Giants at 4-7. And really, this is kind of the team that I think a lot of people are just kind of discounting. Because I think a lot of people are just focusing on the Giants and the Eagles as the two main teams that are probably going to come out of the division. And to a certain extent, I kind of believe them. But I think some people are disregarding what Washington has on this team. And I know they're going to be without Kyle Allen for the rest of the year after he dislocated, I want to say he dislocated his ankle a few weeks ago. And Alex Smith has stepped in. And I think ever since Alex Smith has stepped in, I think he's done as good a job as anyone really could. I mean, they just absolutely smashed the Cowboys last week on the road on Thanksgiving by the score of 41-16. So they looked really impressive that day. They had some running back. I forget the kid's name. Had a great game against the Cowboys. He ended up scoring 3 touchdowns for him. And the Washington's win against the Cowboys last week was a really dominant team win on all aspects of the ball, whether it was on the offensive side of the ball or the defensive side of the ball. They just completely manhandled the Cowboys and pretty much took the Cowboys out of NFC East contention as far as I'm concerned. I know the Cowboys are still technically within the race to get the NFC East, but they really did expose how bad the Cowboys are this year. But I mean, Washington has been really competitive in really the last month or so. They only lost to the Giants by 3 points. They lost to the Lions. They lost to the Lions 3 points again the week after. They lost 30-27, and then after that they beat the Bengals, and obviously in that game Joe Burrow went down. So Washington definitely probably got a little bit of an edge there after Joe Burrow went down, and then they absolutely destroyed the Cowboys last week. So I think this is really the one team that not a lot of people are paying attention to. And I mean, just kind of looking at their schedule, excuse me, they got the Steelers next, which is going to be a really tough game for them. They've got the 49ers, and the 49ers are a very tough team. I know they've had a bunch of injuries this year, but despite those injuries that the 49ers have, that team is tough, and they play all 60 minutes, and they do not give up. So that's going to be, I think, a difficult matchup for the 49ers as well. And then they got the Seahawks after that, and then the Panthers, and then the Eagles to wrap up the year. Kind of a similar situation with the Giants. These next 3 games, I think, are going to be very difficult for them. And there's a potential that they could lose all 3 because I think Washington's going to have their hands full with the Steelers. Now, the Steelers might be an interesting game because the Steelers are really coming off of 4 days rest because they just played against the Ravens yesterday. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Steelers play. Washington could try to make that a game, but I still got the Steelers in that one. I just don't believe in Washington to beat the 49ers on the road. And then I think the Seahawks are going to come into Washington. I think the Seahawks are probably going to get that win. Really, the only 2 games I think they have a shot at winning are the last 2 games of the season against the Panthers and the Eagles. Other than those 2 games, I don't really see Washington winning these other 3 matches for the next 3 weeks. So, like I said with the Giants, it's going to be tough hill sledding for the Giants, and I think it's going to be the same thing with Washington here too. But if I had to give them a grade based on where they are right now, I'm going to probably give them like the same grade as the Giants. I'm going to give them a C plus. I think giving any more credit to this team would be a little bit too positive, or at least I don't want to give them too much credit in this sense. So I think a C plus, maybe a C, somewhere around there, I think is probably going to be the best grade for them. Like I said, they're 4-7. I think to give them anything above that is giving them too much credit. So C plus C range is where I'm going to put the Washington football team at. Then up next, we got the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles are at 3-7-1. They just came off of a loss to Seattle last week on Monday Night Football. And this team is just a disappointment through and through. The one thing that I will say is I do think that Carson Wentz, to a certain extent, is getting too much of the blame for how bad the Eagles have played. I'm not saying that he doesn't deserve all. What I'm going to say is that he doesn't deserve all of the blame. He definitely does deserve a lot of blame because his decision making that he's had really throughout the entire season has been bad. He leads the league in turnovers. I believe he leads the league in interceptions as well, which is never a good stat to have. And he's just not getting it done. But I will say this, there are a lot more issues on the offensive side of the ball than just Carson Wentz. The offensive line is atrocious. Carson Wentz really doesn't have that many guys to throw to because the wide receivers really can't gain any separation. And Zach Ertz, really one of their best playmakers on the team, has been hurt the entire year, has been hurt for most of the season. So it's very tough for Carson Wentz to really throw to a bunch of guys who really can't gain any separation against their defenders. And you have to put a lot of blame on Doug Peterson as well. I think his decision-making as well, his play calling has been pretty bad this year. And I think that's putting it lightly. And I remember just watching that Seahawks game a few days ago, and I was thinking that the Eagles had multiple opportunities to actually win that game against a really good football team in Seattle. But they just made some terrible choices. And one in particular, I know I don't want to get too hard on Carson Wentz here, but I remember there was a fourth down play, and they're in the red zone, and there was a guy running a shallow under route just right across the middle of the field, and Carson Wentz just throws it to the end zone and throws one of the easiest interceptions that a DB will ever have. I mean, it was right to the DB, and I don't even know who Carson Wentz was throwing to. I think it was to either Dallas Goedert or Alshon Jeffrey. I forget who he was throwing to in particular, but his decision making was bad. I thought to be honest with you that going on fourth down from Doug Peterson, I thought that was a bad idea as well, and it cost them because they could have actually gotten some points, and it could have made somewhat of a difference. But I mean, just looking at the last couple games that they played in, they lost to the Browns 2 weeks ago. They lost to the Giants, and they did beat the Cowboys about a month ago, but that's not really that impressive of a win because of how Dallas has been this year. Moving forward, the Eagles definitely have a tough road as well because just looking at their schedule here, they got to play the Packers, they got to play the Saints, and then they got to play the Cardinals. Really, those three teams are going to be tough matchups for the Eagles, and there's a very good chance that they're probably going to lose all three of those games. And then the last two games of the year, they're both divisional games. They play the Cowboys and then Washington. They'll probably beat the Cowboys. But that Washington game is going to be, I think it's going to be a tough one for them. Technically, they are at home, so the Eagles do have somewhat of an advantage there, but not much. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough sledding for the Eagles as well, and I think that's going to be kind of a consistent theme for the rest of the games that all these NFC East teams have to play for the latter part of the season. But if I had to give them a grade for where they stand right now, I'm just going to give them a D. They have really disappointed this year. Carson Wentz's play has been bad. The offensive line has been bad. It's just the offensive side of the ball has been so dysfunctional for the Eagles this year. It's the reason why I think in large part they're losing these games because the defense is not really the issue here. So, I mean, ever since they played the Ravens, they haven't given up more than 30 points. Every other game, they've basically been hovering around, giving around mid-20s. So these are winnable games as far as I'm concerned. for the Eagles, but the offense is just so dysfunctional. And until they get that straightened out, they're not going to go anywhere. But if I have to give them a grade based on where they are right now, I'm going to give them a D. And then to wrap up the NFC East, we'll talk about the Cowboys. And the Cowboys, I said this after Dak suffered that gruesome leg injury where he broke his leg and was out for the season. I really think that the loss of Dak Prescott for the Cowboys just completely gutted them for the season. And it shows outside of the one game that they had against the Vikings 2 weeks ago where they beat the Vikings on the road, which was a surprise to many. It was really a surprise to me. They've been pretty bad. They got absolutely smoked by Washington about a week before Halloween. They lost to the Eagles a week after. They had a close game against the Steelers, but ended up losing that game. They did get that win against the Vikings, and then they got absolutely smashed by Washington at home on Thanksgiving last week. And then looking at their next couple of games, they got to deal with the Ravens, they got to deal with the Bengals, and the 49ers. Those are their next 3 games. I'll tell you what, the Ravens matchup is going to be a tough one for them, and I think that 49ers matchup is going to be a difficult one for them. But outside of that, they do have some winnable games here. I think they have a decent shot to beat the Bengals, not this week, but next week. And I think they have a decent shot to beat the Eagles and maybe the Giants. I would say that the odds are probably stacked against them at this point, but they're 3-8-1. Excuse me, they're not 3-8-1. The Eagles are. I think the Cowboys are 3-8. Excuse me. So technically, they're not even that. They're not even that far out of the race. They're technically really only one game out of the race, but they're gonna have to really get it together if they're gonna have to make if they want to make some sort of move to get into the playoffs. I think, to be honest with you, out of all the NFC team, out of all the NFC East teams, the Cowboys have the easiest schedule moving forward. But because I think the Cowboys are just that inept of a team, I think they're going to be lucky to win two games here. I think they're the best shot that they have to win games this year are going to be for the rest of the year are against the Bengals and maybe the Eagles. I think the Giants are going to beat the Cowboys. I think the Eagles-Cowboys matchup, that's probably going to be the biggest game for them because they could win that one. But I don't think they're going to beat the Giants. I don't think they're going to beat the 49ers, and I don't think they're going to beat the Ravens. So moving forward, Dallas has played so bad this year, and a lot of it has to do with Dak being out for the season, and they just haven't shown anything. They haven't shown anything to me since that injury outside of maybe 1 or 2 games. So I think the Cowboys are just in a really tough spot here, and I'd really be surprised if they end up coming out of the NFC East as the division winners. So if I have to give them a grade, I think I'm going to basically give them the same grade as the Eagles. I'm going to give them a D. They've just been atrocious this year. Granted, they've had injuries, they've had COVID issues, but this team should be better than 3-8. And they, like I said with the Eagles, the Cowboys have been just as big as a disappointment as the Eagles have been this year, and that's why they're getting the same grade. So with that out of the way, we'll move on to the NFC West. So this is a much better division, probably one of the better divisions, if not the best division in football right now, because we got a pretty stacked division here. So we'll start with Seattle. They're currently sitting at 8-3, and like I said, they just came off the road win against the Eagles last week. And I think right now, really, Seattle has kind of set themselves apart from from most of the NFC, and they're really what I believe as like the top 3 teams in the NFC as of right now. They have been a little bit shaky the last couple weeks. I will say this: Russell Wilson has definitely cooled off since that hot start at the beginning of the season that he had, but they're still winning games. And even despite some of the shaky performances that the Seahawks have had, in large part due to some of the bad games that Russell Wilson has had, they're still pretty stable in the NFC as far as I'm concerned. They're sitting at 8-3, and a lot of these games that they've been in, they've won some big games, and then they lost some tough games as well. Just looking at the last couple of games that they played in at the beginning of November, they beat the 49ers. Then they lost on the road to the Bills a week after. They lost to the Rams the week after that, so they lost 2 games in a row there. They did beat the Cardinals at home, which was a monster win for them because they really needed that win to kind of stabilize their season and not go on a 3-game slide. And then they went on the road to beat the Eagles last week. So I think in large part they've been able to stabilize themselves after that 2-game slide when they lost to the Bills and the Rams. Like I said, I think this team is starting to really shore up some things going into the latter part of the season. And I think really the Seahawks are geared for a solid playoff run this year. Don't know what's going to happen in the playoffs, but I think they're starting to get things right at really a good time. Their defense has been playing better the last few weeks. Ever since that Bills game where they gave up 44 points, they've really turned it around. The most points that they've given up was 21 points against the Cardinals 2 weeks ago. And I think looking at their next couple games, they've got some really winnable games here. They put the Giants next week. If I had to say the Seahawks are probably going to win that one, they're going to beat the Jets the week after that. They should beat Washington on the road. And then they finish up the season with 2 divisional games against the Rams and the 49ers. Those 2 games I think are going to be tough for Seattle. But I do think that Seattle's probably going to bounce back after losing to the Rams a few weeks ago. And I think just overall from a talent perspective, I think Seattle's too good for the 49ers, despite the fact that the 49ers have had just a bevy of injuries the entire year. So I'll give them an edge there. I could realistically I see the Seahawks potentially winning 4 out of these 5 games. I think the only game that they might lose maybe either the Rams. The only game that I really see them losing is the Rams. Outside of that, they have a very good chance to win all 5 of their games to finish off the season. And that could really set them up either being 12-4 or 13-3. I think at worst they end up 11-5. But they would really have to drop some winnable games to get to 11-5. And I just don't foresee that happening. So if I had to give them a grade for at this point in the season, I'm going to give them an A-. I think they've earned it. They definitely had that slide a couple weeks in a row, but I think they've been able to turn things around, get things going in the right direction. That defense is starting to play a lot better than they were, especially in the beginning part of the season. And I think as a team, they're really starting to form a solid team moving forward into really the last part of the season. So I'm going to give them an A-. Moving on, we got the Rams. So the Rams are currently sitting at 7-4. They're second place in the NFC West at this point. And the Rams honestly should be 8-3 at this point. And it was very disappointing for me to see them drop, I think, a very winnable game against the 49ers last week at home. I think losing to the 49ers with all of the injuries that the 49ers have had this entire season. I mean, the 49ers have basically been a mash unit at this point, which is the number of injuries that they had. I believe they have like 13 guys on IR, or they had 13 guys on IR going into that game last week. And then the 49ers were able to pull out a win on the road against the Rams. That was a huge win for the 49ers. But outside of that, the Rams have been playing solid ball the last month or so. So just kind of looking at the last few games that they played in, they won against the Bears fairly convincingly, and that was the last week of October. Then they played the Dolphins, and they did drop a road loss there. They did drop a road game there. The Dolphins looked absolutely outstanding that day. Just they were able to really get after Jared Goff and force some turnovers, and that was really the difference of the game. But then they had a big win against Seattle at home the week after, and then they beat the Buccaneers, which was a huge game on the road. They won that one by the score of 27-24, but then they drop an easy one to the 49ers. So this team, I think, this is a solid team. The Rams have a solid offense. Their defense is pretty stout with Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey running the show. That defense is going to be solid for the rest of the year. So my concern with the Rams really isn't their defense. It is their offense. If Jared Goff does not turn the ball over, this is a very good team. But if he turns the ball over, they're just an average team. And against the 49ers last week, they turned the ball over, and that was the reason why they ended up losing that game. So looking at the next couple games that they have, though, they got a really tough divisional matchup against the Cardinals this week. They play the Patriots after that. They play the Jets. Then they play the Seahawks again. and then they got the Cardinals again to wrap up the year. Really tough matchups here. I think, to be honest with you, the Rams are going to have their work cut out for the next month or so, because the Cardinals are going to be a tough out. Are going to be a tough out on the road. The Rams should beat the Patriots, but the Patriots, if the Patriots play solid defense against Jared Goff, that may be a tougher matchup than a lot of people expect. They should beat the Jets fairly convincingly. But the last two games, it's going to be very tough to go up against Seattle on the road, and then they got the Cardinals at home to wrap up the year. So, excuse me, they got to play Seattle on the road. The Rams aren't at home; they're on the road for that Seattle game. So they're definitely going to have their work cut out for them. It's definitely going to be an uphill battle for the Rams moving forward. I could realistically see them losing 3 out of 5 games here, just because these divisional matchups are always tough and you never know which way they're going to go. But based off of where they're at right now, I'm going to give them a B+. I would have probably given them an A- if they beat the 49ers last week, but that loss was a really bad loss to have. And like I said, if they were able to win that game against the 49ers, they probably would have gotten an A-. But as it stands right now, they're sitting around a B+ right now. So we'll move on to the Cardinals next. So the Cardinals are currently at 6-5, and there was a lot of hype really going into this team after the Cardinals went on that Hail Mary pass from Kyler Murray to DeAndre Hopkins against the Bills a couple weeks ago. And I think ever since then, they have really cooled off. Because at that point, they were sitting at 6-3. They had a very viable shot to win the NFC West at that point. They were competitive with the Rams and the Seahawks at that point. And it was looking like that the Arizona Cardinals could really compete and take the top spot in the NFC West. But then they've dropped 2 games since then. They lost to the Seahawks on the road 2 weeks ago. And then they dropped an easy one to the Patriots on the road as well. They lost by 3 points to the Patriots last week. So they're really on a slide right now, and I think they're kind of in a similar situation that the Seahawks were in a couple weeks ago when they lost 2 games in a row. I think this Rams matchup that they have this week is going to be crucial for them. If they win this one, they kind of stabilize their season. But if they lose this one, they drop down to 6-6, and it's tough sledding for them. But just looking at the next couple games that they have, like I said, they play the Rams next week. They have a winnable matchup against the Giants the week after. They have another winnable matchup against the Eagles after that. And then they finish off with the 49ers and the Rams. And like I said, those divisional matchups are always going to be difficult. So the biggest thing I think moving forward for the for the Cardinals is Kyler Murray has to be healthy. If he's not healthy, this team is going to be pretty limited in what it can do offensively. And the defense can only hold up for so much. Because really the last couple weeks, the defense has been shaky. They gave up 34 points to the Seahawks at the end of October. They gave up 34 to the Dolphins the week after that. They gave up 30 to the Bills the week after that, and they almost gave up another 30 to the Seahawks after that. So the defense definitely has to step it up, especially if Kyler Murray is not 100%. So there's definitely some issues on this team, and if Kyler Murray is not 100% healthy for the last part of the season, it's going to be difficult for this team to really kind of reinsert themselves to be in the top spot in the NFC West at this point. If I had to give them a grade, I'm going to give them a C. I'm going to give them a B-, maybe a C+, just because that Patriot loss last week was a big-time loss. That was a game that they should have won. Should have been a fairly easy win for them, but they kept the Patriots in it, and the Patriots ended up beating them. So, as it stands right now, yeah, I'm going to give them a C+ at this point, just because that Patriot loss was a bad one to have. So the last team that we have in the NFC West are the San Francisco 49ers. Currently, they're sitting at 5-6. Here's the thing about the 49ers. It is absolutely unbelievable to me that they are sitting at 5-6 with all the injuries that they had. They've lost so many key pieces on the offensive side of the ball, whether it's Jimmy Garoppolo. They lost Raheem Mostert for most part of the season. They lost Tevin Coleman for large stretches of the season. Greg Kittle is probably out for the rest of the season. I mean, those 4 guys are essentially the entire offense. Outside of Deebo Samuel and maybe Brandon Ayuk, the heart and soul of that offense basically runs through Jimmy Garoppolo, George Kittle. I'm I always get his first. I think it's Greg Kittle. Excuse me, Greg Kittle. And losing Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman, those are big losses, and those are very difficult pieces to replace. But this team has shown time and time again that they've been able to overcome adversity and somehow manage to be somewhat of a viable team despite all the injuries that they had. I give them a lot of credit for that. You got to give a lot of credit to the coaching staff. They've been outstanding as far as I'm concerned to get them to this point. And even Richard Sherman said it after the game against the Rams last week, to somehow manage to get this team ready to go and beat a really good Rams team on the road. It's absolutely sensational what the 49ers have been able to accomplish this year. I know their record doesn't show it, but the fact that they're 5-6 is unbelievable to me. If this were any other team where you lose your quarterback and you lose 2 to 3 your top guys on your offense for most of the season, most teams would probably be sitting around 3-8, 2-9, or like 4-7. What the 49ers have been able to accomplish this year has been absolutely outstanding, and I give them a lot of credit for that. So, looking at their next couple of games, they've got a tough matchup against the Bills. They've got a winnable game against the Washington football team after that. They've got another winnable game against the Cowboys after that. And then the last 2 games of the year, they have difficult matchups with the 49ers, with the Cardinals and the Seahawks. So it's going to be very interesting to see where this team ends up going. I think best case scenario for them is that they end up around 7-9. I don't think they're going to make it to 8-8. If they were to make it at 8-8, if they were able to make it to 8-8 on this type of year, it'd be absolutely incredible as far as I'm concerned. But I just don't think it's going to happen. I think they're probably going to finish around 7 or 9 or 6-10. I think 6-10 might be a little bit too low for them. I think 7-9 is probably going to be their record at the end of the season. So if I had to give them a grade, just for pure effort and heart, I'm going to give them a B, just because I think in large part this team has really overperformed with the amount of injuries that they had. So I give them a lot of credit for that. So give the 49ers respect for that. So up next, we got the NFC North. So we'll first start with the Packers. The Packers are sitting pretty good at 8-3. And to me, this is one of the best teams in the NFC as far as I'm concerned. The last couple weeks, they've looked pretty good. They have dropped some games, though. So they lost to the Colts in overtime a few weeks back. They did lose to the Vikings at home. That was where Dalvin Cook just absolutely shredded the entire Packers defense. But I'll say this. Outside of those 2 games, I think the Packers have looked pretty good this season. Aaron Rodgers is having an MVP-type season this year. Whether he gets it or not, we'll see. But he's definitely up for an MVP discussion at this point. I really like where this team is sitting at right now. They just absolutely smashed the Bears on Sunday Night Football this past week. So I think right now, just looking at the rest of the schedule for the Packers here, the Packers really only have one tough game left, and that's against the Titans in the second to last game of the year. Outside of that, their next 4 games are pretty winnable. They got the Eagles next week. That should be a win. They should beat the Lions the week after that. They should beat the Panthers the week after that. Like I said, that Titans game is going to be a tough one for them. They are playing at home, so I guess that's I'd favor the Packers a little bit in that game, but definitely watch out for Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry could have a monster day against that Packers rush defense. And then they have an easy game on the road against the Bears to end the season. So realistically, I can see this team going either 11-5 or 12-4. Like I said, this is a really good team. This is, I think, probably the second best team in the NFC as far as I'm concerned. And they're really kind of setting themselves up for a solid run in the playoffs this year. So I like where the Packers are at. If I'm giving them a grade, I'm going to give them an A-. They've been playing extremely well, and I expect them to finish off the season fairly strong going into the playoffs. And then up next, we got the Vikings. The Vikings are currently sitting at 5-6. Now, when I did my first NFC report card, the Vikings were at the bottom of the barrel just because they were a terrible team. They had a terrible start to the season, but ever since then, they have made a monster turnaround. And granted, they're not going to win the NFC North at this point. They're too far behind, and the Packers are just are really a step above everybody else in that division. So looking at this team, though, they've really been able to turn it around ever since, I'd say, the beginning of November. They beat the Packers on the road. They beat the Lions the week after. They beat the Bears after that, and they did drop it. They did drop that Cowboys game at home, which honestly they should have won that game. I don't know how you let the Cowboys, who are a terrible team, beat you at home, and that was a bad loss. And then they had a big win against the Panthers last week in a very close game. So they've definitely been able to find some sort of identity offensively. I've said this before, and I'll say this again. Kirk Cousins is one of the aspects of that team that just infuriates me the most, because he's a decent quarterback when he doesn't turn the ball over. But when he turns the ball over, he tends to do it in bunches and throws potentially 2 to 3 picks a game in really bad games. So Kirk Cousins is really the X factor for this team and whether or not this team is going to move forward or not. Dalvin Cook has been a monster this year. He's really stepped up his game since, I'd say, probably the beginning of November, and he is definitely asserting himself. He's definitely inserting himself as one of the best running backs in the game, and they're going to need him moving forward. They've got an easy matchup against the Jaguars next week. They should win that game. They've got a pretty big game against the Buccaneers after that, but I think they have a decent chance to win that one because the Bucs are kind of on a slide right now. Then they got the Bears after that. They've got the Saints and then the Lions. So the way that I see it is they can win 3 games here. I think that Bucs game and the Saints game are going to be very difficult for them to win. I think they have an outside shot to beat the Bucs, but I'm going to probably favor the Bucs in that game. But I think best case scenario is they win 4 out of 5 here, and they make it to 9-7 at that point. But I think realistically, I see them winning 3 games to end the season, and they're probably going to finish 8-8, which could be good enough to actually make it to the playoffs. We'll see how it goes, but I think if the Vikings win if they win 3 out of the next 5 games, they've got a decent shot to make the playoffs. So I'm not going to count them out. But as it stands right now, to give them a grade, just because they've turned it around in a pretty significant way, I'm going to give them a B-. I know the record doesn't show it, but they've really been playing solid football the last month or so. So I'm going to give them a B-. And then we move on to the Bears. And the Bears are just, oh my God, I don't even know where to start with the Bears. The Bears are probably one of the most frustrating teams to watch, because when this team plays bad, it plays absolutely horrendous football. So just kind of looking at their last couple of games, like I said, they got smacked by the Packers on Sunday Night Football this past week. They lost a close game against the Vikings the week before that. They lost to the Titans the week before that, and they lost to the Saints the week before that. So they've lost 4 straight games, and they've looked really bad in all 4 of those games. So they're going to have to figure out the quarterback situation, because I think in large part, if the offense doesn't get it together, this team is going nowhere. Whether it's Nick Foles or Mitchell Trubisky, they're going to have to pick somebody to lead this team forward. And I just don't see it happening. I think this team is so dysfunctional offensively. I could realistically see them losing probably 3 out of their next 5 games, just because their offense is that bad. I mean, just looking at the next couple games that they have, they've got the Lions next week. The Bears should win that game. If the Bears lose that game, it's over. They'll have lost 5 straight games at that point, and their season is basically realistically over at that point. They got the Texans after that. That's a winnable game for the Bears, but Deshaun Watson has been stepping up his game the last couple weeks, so that game was really kind of a toss-up at this point. They got the Vikings after that, the Jaguars after that, and then they play against the Packers to end the season. To be honest with you, they could lose 4 out of these next 5 games, and they'll probably finish around 6-10. And I think that's probably where they're going to end up. I don't have a lot of trust in the Bears right now. I don't have a lot of faith in them. I think really their best shot is probably against the Jaguars, the second last game of the year for them. But outside of that, the Packers matchup is a bad one for them. The Vikings matchup is a bad one for them. I think that Texans one is potentially a bad one against is a bad matchup for the Bears. And the Lions, it's a divisional game, so you never know what could happen. So it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough sledding for the Bears, and I think they could be in real trouble if they really start dropping these next couple of games. If they go on a 5-6 game slide, it's over. It's over as far as I'm concerned. So to give them a grade, I'm going to give them a C minus. They've been playing really bad football the last month or so, and if they don't get it turned around soon, they're looking at possibly being the last team in the division, which we'll move on to the final team in the NFC North, which will be the Detroit Lions. So the Lions are currently sitting at 4-7. The Lions are just an inept team at this point. They just fired Matt Patricia last week. Not really a surprise. I think it was long overdue. I think a lot of the players were actually kind of glad to see him go. I did see reports that there were teammates celebrating in the locker room after he got fired. So that really kind of goes to show, whether it's true or not, that the team by and large did just not buy into Matt Patricia's idea for the team. So who knows? They may get a bump from Matt Patricia being fired just because they wanted to see him gone. They could beat the Bears next week. But just kind of looking at this team is just mediocre. They really haven't done anything to really throw me. They lost to the Texans last week in a really they really got smashed by the Texans last week on Thanksgiving. They got shut out against the Panthers the week before that. They did beat Washington 3 weeks ago, and then they lost to the Vikings on the road at the beginning of November. So the Lions are just a mediocre team. They're not going anywhere. They're going to lose to the Packers 2 weeks from now. They're probably going to lose to the Titans the week after that. They've got a really tough matchup against the Bucs after that. This team is going nowhere. Realistically, I think the only win that they'll probably get is against the Bears next week. That's probably the only winnable game for them. But then after that, they've got a gauntlet of a stretch where they're going up against 4 either decent or above average teams. And I realistically see them probably losing 4 out of these next 5 games. So it's going to be very difficult for the Lions to get any sort of decent stretch to end the season. So if I had to give them a grade, I'm giving them a D. They just haven't played up to par this year, and it's another year of Matt Stafford's talent being wasted. And to be honest with you, he's putting up stats, but the team is just going nowhere. And until they really get the defense figured out, this team is just going to be mediocre for as far as I'm concerned. And then we'll move on to the last division in the NFC. So we got the NFC South. So we'll start with the Saints. So the Saints are currently sitting at 9-2, and the Saints are probably the best team in the NFC right now, and that's despite the fact that they've not had Drew Brees in the lineup for the last few games or so with those broken ribs. So just looking at the last couple of games that they've been in, they won an easy matchup against the Broncos last week, beat the Falcons the week before that, beat the 49ers, and they absolutely smashed the Buccaneers in one of the biggest blowouts that I've ever seen. So right now they're on a 4-game winning streak. They're looking really good right now. And their schedule is fairly easy moving forward. They do have 1 or 2 tough games here. The only really 2 games that I see that could be a potential issue for them is they play the Chiefs. Not the Chiefs. They play the Chiefs in 2 weeks from now. So, actually, no, I'm sorry. They play in 3 weeks against the Chiefs. My apologies for that. So that'll be an interesting game for them. And then they got the Vikings after that. So those are 2 tough games for them. And the Saints will only be on 5 days rest at that point. So that Vikings game could be a tough one for them. But outside of that, they should beat the Falcons next week. They got the Eagles after that. And then the last game of the season for them is against the Panthers. So I think realistically, they're going to win at least 3 of these games. They could potentially win 4, but they're probably going to lose 1 or 2 games here. I think best case scenario for them is that they finish 13-3, probably at the top of the NFC. I think worst case scenario is they finish 11-5. I don't really foresee that happening. They're probably going to go 12. They're probably either go 12-4 or 13-3. It's somewhere around there. This team is a really good team, and despite losing Drew Brees, they've been able to just keep chugging along. And if they're able to do that, they should be setting up for the number 1 spot in the NFC. So I have to give them a grade. I'm giving them an A+. They're at the top of the NFC, and they've been able to play really good, consistent football, despite the fact that Drew Brees has been out the last few weeks. So I'm giving them an A+. So up next, we got the Bucs, and the Bucs have been struggling the last few weeks. It has not been easy for the Bucs this last month or so. So looking at the last couple games that they've been in some dogfights. So looking at the Giants from a month ago, they only beat the Giants by 2 points, and that was in the beginning of November. They lost to the Saints in an embarrassing Sunday night loss. Then they beat the brakes off the Panthers. And then the last 2 games that they've been in, whether it was against the Rams or the Chiefs, just couldn't get it done. They lost by 3 points in both of those games. So it's going to be interesting to see where this team goes. They need to figure out the offensive side of the ball right now. I don't know. It just seems like the offense is really dysfunctional right now because I think the play calling is not up to where it's supposed to be. And Brady's not playing that well either. I think Brady does definitely need to get it together for really the last 4 games of the year if they want to make some sort of a stretch, if they want to make some sort of decent stretch to go into the playoffs. They've got some winnable games, though. They play the Falcons twice. They play the Vikings and the Lions. Those are 4 winnable games as far as I'm concerned. If they finish 11-5, I think they'll be okay. And I think to end the season on a 4-game winning streak could set them up for a solid run in the playoffs. But they need to win all 4 of these games. If they lose any of these games, I would not expect anything big from the Buccaneers in the playoffs this year. Just don't expect it. They might win. They might win in the first round, but who knows after that? But they have to win these next 4 games if they want to be if they want to be somewhat respected in the NFC. So they're gonna have to really get it together. So I have to give them a grade. I'm giving them a C+. They've really been inconsistent the last few weeks, and until they get those issues straightened out, I don't think they're gonna go that far into the playoffs this year. They'll make the playoffs, but I don't know if they're gonna make it that far. So they need to kind of get it together at this point. And then up next, we got the Falcons at 4-7. Really, the Falcons have just been so inconsistent this year, but they have been playing better football as of late. They've won 3 out of their last 4 games. And there's really not much for me to say here. I mean, granted, they beat the Raiders 43-6 last week, so that was an impressive win for them. I'm sorry, they haven't won 3 out of the last 4 games. They've won 2 out of their last 4 games, if I'm reading this right. No, I take that back. They've won 3 out of the last 4. I don't know what I'm doing. So, I mean, at this point for the Falcons, though, they're 4-7. They're not going to make the playoffs at this point. They got the Saints next week. That's going to be a loss. They got to go on the road to the Chargers. Then they play the Bucs twice to finish off the year, and they play the Chiefs. They're probably going to lose 4 out of these next 5 games. The Falcons haven't done anything really special this year outside of that 1 win against the Raiders last week, and I expect kind of more of the same, just kind of more of an inconsistent team. I think realistically they're probably going to finish like 5-11 or 6-10. Give them a grade. I'm giving them a C-. They're just not that special of a team. And then the last team that we have here in the NFC is the Carolina Panthers. And I'll say this. Carolina has been I think this is a team that is at least starting to figure some things out with Teddy Bridgewater running the show. But like I said, with the Falcons, just not that impressive of a team. They do play competitive, and they do play for all 60 minutes, but just their record just doesn't show it. And I think really until this team is able to figure out some things on the defensive side of the ball, they're going to kind of be a mediocre team moving forward. I think offensively, they've had their injuries this year on the offensive side of the ball because Christian McCaffrey has been pretty much out for most of the season this year, just dealing with an assortment of injuries. And it's kind of gone the show. So just kind of looking at their next 4 games to wrap up the year. They play the Broncos next week. They got the Packers after that. They got Washington after that, and then they got the Saints. So realistically, I could see them winning 2 games here. They should beat the Broncos, and they should probably beat Washington. But that Packers matchup and the Saints matchup is definitely going to be a tough one for them. So I think realistically, they're probably going to finish around 6-10. If they're really lucky, they finish 7-9. But I think 6-10 is probably going to be the record. Is going to be their record for this year. If I have to give them a grade, I'm just going to give them a C-. Excuse me, they're 4-8 at this point. So, yeah, it's going to be difficult for them moving forward. Like I said, best case scenario, they finish like 6-10. But that'll wrap up the NFC report card. Like I said, with the Saints, really the Saints are the cream of the crop in the NFC at this point. Looks like they're setting themselves up for the number 1 spot. But definitely keep your eyes out for the Packers and the Seahawks. Those two teams could definitely make a run to get that top spot as well if the Saints end up dropping a few games. So we'll see how it goes. But as of right now, the Saints do look like the top team in the NFC, and they have a pretty viable path to get there as far as I'm concerned. So up next, we'll transition into some NBA news. So there's just a few stories that we're going to go over here. And the first one that we'll go over is obviously the big news regarding the Washington Wizards and the Houston Rockets. So the Wizards and the Rockets agreed to a trade between Russell Westbrook going to the Wizards and John Wall going to the Houston Rockets. So for me, this trade really doesn't do anything that much for me because I think by and large, you're essentially trading two players of the same caliber who are basically kind of in the same part of their career. I think most people acknowledge that John Wall and Russell Westbrook are probably not really in their primes anymore as far as I'm concerned. They're still viable players, and I don't want to impugn their playing ability. They are extremely viable players in the NBA still. But moving forward, I don't think they're going to be the central points to their teams. I think really at this point, when it comes to the Washington Wizards, I think most of the show is going to be run around Bradley Beal. We'll see how Russell Westbrook impacts that team. But, I mean, outside of Beal and Russell Westbrook, there's not too many players that I'm really familiar with on the Washington Wizards roster. I know a couple of these guys. I know a couple of their names. I know Thomas Bryant. I know Moritz Wagner and Shabazz Napier. But outside of those guys, just not much to show for the Wizards. Now with Houston's in a little bit of they're in an interesting situation here. If you look at their roster on paper, it doesn't necessarily look that bad. You've got James Harden, you've got Eric Gordon, John Wall, and DeMarcus Cousins. On paper, doesn't look that bad. However, DeMarcus Cousins is coming off of what I believe was I think he tore his Achilles a year and a half ago. So he'll come back for the first time since I believe 2018 or 2019. And then you got John Wall, who is one of the most injury-prone players in the NBA. And the thing is, you got James Harden, who's going to run the show, and then Eric Gordon is going to be essentially the guy that they're going to kick the ball out to knock down either some mid-range jumpers or mostly three-point shots. So on paper, it doesn't look bad. I just think the way that this team is assembled, I don't know if it's necessarily going to work. I think realistically, they're going to be a viable team in the Western Conference this year. I don't think they're going to be I don't think they're going to be a championship contending team this year, but I do think they won't be a pushover either. I think they could realistically kind of be like a middle of the pack team this year in the West. I mean, if you have those four players on that team, you should be at least a decent team in the West. I know the West is stacked this year to begin with, but I think Houston has definitely improved their roster somewhat since apparently James Harden threatened to leave Houston a few weeks ago. So I think their front office has definitely addressed the Harden aspect of trying to improve the team around him. But is it enough for Houston to make a championship run? I don't think so. So really, in the end, I think this trade is kind of negligible for each team. I think if I had to kind of pick a team that has the better future from this trade, I think it's probably Houston. I would kind of give the edge there. But overall, this trade really doesn't do anything that much for me. And the Wizards are going to go absolutely nowhere with Westbrook. It wouldn't have mattered whether John Wall stayed with the team or not. So I think Russell Westbrook is definitely going to have his work cut out for in Washington. I think Washington's going to be one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference as far as I'm concerned. But we'll see. Who knows? They could turn out to be a somewhat okay team, but I think it's more likely than not that the Wizards are going to be one of the lower end teams in the East. And like I said with the Rockets, I think they're going to be a viable team in the West, but I don't think they're going to be a championship contending team this year. That's just kind of how I see it, even though that they did add John Wall to the roster. Then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the Lakers. The Lakers were able to re-up LeBron James and Anthony Davis to contract extensions. So we'll start with LeBron James. So LeBron agreed to a 2-year, $85 million extension with the Lakers. That essentially keeps him locked in until the 2022-2023 season, if I remember correctly. And then Anthony Davis is locked up for another 5 years with the Lakers, which is a huge extension for them. It essentially gives, as it stands right now, LeBron another 3-year window to go after a few more titles if that's the end goal for them. So I think this is obviously we were all expecting that Anthony Davis was going to re-sign with the Lakers. It was just under what context, just how would the team be looking going into this year. I think the Lakers have really improved their roster from last year, even though they won a championship last year. I think they've definitely made some key improvements to their roster this year that I think are going to even help them more going into this year. So Anthony Davis re-signing with them doesn't surprise me. LeBron James getting an extension really doesn't surprise me that much either. So all in all, I think the Lakers with really, these two signings, it doesn't really change my future prospects for them. They're going to be one of the top teams, if not the top team in the West this year. And I mean, at this point, with LeBron and AD running the show, you're guaranteed to probably at least get to the Western Conference Finals this year. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. But the Lakers do look primed for another really what I would consider probably a 2 to 3 year window to go and win some titles, go and win some championships. So the Lakers are definitely in a good spot right now. And with that said, you guys, that'll pretty much wrap up the episode. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to this version of the Home Field Podcast. So obviously for next week's episodes, we'll definitely go over the NFL Week 13 matchups. Definitely stay on the lookout for the picks. I'll drop the picks and scores for the games for NFL Week 13 probably either Friday or Saturday. I haven't decided on which day, but it'll probably either be on Friday or Saturday. Obviously, we'll keep an eye on some NBA news. We'll see where it goes. Obviously, we're getting closer to the start of the season, so the start of the season is only 3 weeks away, so there could be some more news that comes from the NBA. And it's like I said it before, it's just right now we're really in a stretch of the year where it's predominantly NFL news at this point. So really in college football, there really hasn't been that much to talk about. Pretty much the teams that are up at the top 5 or the top 6 of the AP rankings, they pretty much stayed the same. So it wasn't really that much to talk about. But if there's any changes from the results this weekend in college football, we'll definitely go over that. But as far as I'm concerned, I think most of the teams that are up at the top of the college football playoff rankings right now, I think they're pretty much going to stay pat as far as I'm concerned. But who knows? You never know what could happen. But outside of that, you guys, thank you guys for listening in, and take it easy.